Well, welcome to this week's theory on psychosocial theories and crime. This week we're focusing on psychosocial theories for crime. So recently in our course, we've been focused a lot on environment and how social structures and processes impact crime. But as we move into studying psychosocial theories, we're returning to the individual and how a person's unique traits and experiences can help explain why some of us commit crime and others don't. So as we explore our material this week, we'll be examining 4 factors and how they relate to or help explain crime. And those include intelligence, personality and temperament, cognition, and mental illness. Attempting to quantify intelligence and use it to influence policies and practices related to education, healthcare, and criminal justice is a relatively new practice. So the first intelligence test was created by a French psychologist named Alfred Binet in the early 1900s. Binet's test was used to help children, or rather help identify children who needed special attention in school. It's important to note that Binet did not believe that low intelligence was fixed. He believed it could be improved through training and education. His test, however, was eventually used and altered by eugenicists that believed quote unquote inferior people with low intelligence could not change and should therefore be identified and prevented from having children. Henry Goddard, he's an American psychologist, was one such person. So Goddard is referenced in your textbook, but not really discussed in detail. But shortly after Binet's death in 1908, Goddard created his own version of Binet's intelligence test and used it to make many harmful and really serious impacts on policy in the United States. His work led to people being deported, institutionalized, incarcerated, and even forcibly sterilized due to this notion that low intelligence was not only a predictor of crime and deviancy, but something that couldn't be changed or improved. So late in his life, Goddard finally acknowledged that intelligence actually could improve, as Binet had originally asserted, but forced sterilizations in the US, based largely on Goddard's work, continued into the 1970s. I bring all that up to stress the dark history of using intelligence as a predictor of crime, as well as the deadly and traumatic ramifications of bad science being used to influence and dictate policies related to education, women's bodies, and criminal justice. While the literature related to IQ and crime has produced some interesting and noteworthy considerations, IQ alone does not cause criminal behavior. It's one factor among many that can help explain why some people end up breaking the law. But what makes it interesting causally is how it interacts with other variables, not how it functions in isolation. The field of psychology also gives us insight into how temperament and personality shape behavior. So our temperament has a lot to do with the unique ways in which we take in information, generate social energy, make decisions, and react to the outer world. For example, when I take Kiersey's temperament sorter, I'm an INFJ. This means that I'm introverted. In other words, I'm easily drained by social interaction and I need lots of time alone. I'm intuitive, meaning I'm rather idealistic and aspirational, and I'm more interested in patterns than isolated data. I'm feeling, meaning I'm highly empathetic and I factor in emotion more than rational thought when I make decisions. And lastly, I'm judging, meaning I like things to be highly organized and I'm not very spontaneous. Now, we could certainly point to elements of my temperament as reasons why I'm not a persistent criminal offender. People like me with introverted and judging traits tend to avoid risky behavior. Because I spend a lot of time alone, you could also make the case that throughout my life, I've not been as prone to negative peer influence as extroverted people. My feeling trait certainly makes me less likely to harm someone because empathy comes very naturally to me. However, feelings can also overwhelm me sometimes, which could lead to explosive behavior if I didn't have the skills to regulate and process my emotions, which many criminal offenders struggle with. When I think of times in my life when I have broken rules or even the law, it's usually been due to my idealism, the way I see the world. So for me, that intuitive trait does mean that I often see the world differently than others, which has led me to instances of rebelliousness, social activism, and even civil disobedience. I share all of this to illustrate that traits related to our temperament can absolutely help explain why some of us engage in crime. Like intelligence, however, temperament alone doesn't predict or cause criminality, but it can give us insight into our choices and our behavior. For example, I come back to my emotion trait. Let's imagine that I am a persistent criminal offender in prison for committing a violent felony in the heat of anger. Now, due to my temperament, emotion doesn't influence everyone's choices and behavior to the degree that it does mine. So, in this scenario, not only do I have a special responsibility to learn how to better regulate my feelings, but I may need help learning how to do that. So, maybe with that kind of attention and guidance, I can start to change my patterns of behavior and prevent myself from harming someone in the future. I won't stop being a person that puts emotion above thought. That's my temperament. But understanding my temperament, I can strive to become someone that doesn't allow that strong emotion to result in reactive and harmful behavior. An important point I'm making here is that temperament is not deterministic of behavior, but rather can help us understand how to effectively correct or influence behavior. As a distinct concept from temperament, personality refers to psychological characteristics resulting from how temperament interacts with experiences. In other words, temperament is not learned, but personality is. To demonstrate this, let's look at introversion versus shyness. These two things may resemble one another, but they are actually very different. Introversion is related to temperament and expresses how someone generates social energy and connection. Shyness, on the other hand, is related to personality and is associated with anxiety or fear regarding social connection or social exposure. Now, both may result in someone preferring time alone, but one, introversion, is an innate trait, and the other, shyness, is developed through life experiences as well as social and cultural factors. So, as your textbook explains, there are many personality traits associated with criminal behavior. And while these traits can be difficult to change, especially as we age into adulthood, personality is something that can be shaped throughout the lifespan. Something I notice in my work with criminal offenders is that a lot of them exhibit similar patterns in the way they think. And these patterns are typically dysfunctional and problematic in that they can generate unnecessary negative emotions. They can rationalize narcissistic perspectives, and they can sometimes dissuade someone from taking responsibility for their actions. This is important because thinking does determine behavior. So theoretically, if we can alter the way someone processes information and forms conclusions, we can change the decisions they make about how to behave. In your textbook this week, you were introduced to Walter's lifestyle theory. So in this theory, Walters asserts that crime is a product of how early biological and social conditions, such as genetics and our level of attachment to an early caregiver, lead to common errors in thinking, which result in patterns of egocentric, self-indulgent, controlling, and even impulsive behavior. According to Walters, the key to correcting someone's criminal behavior is to correct the way they think. Walters identifies 8 types of criminal thinking or thinking errors. Now, these include super optimism. This is the idea that you will escape consequences for future bad behavior because you've escaped consequences in the past. Next, mollification. This involves blaming other people for your behavior or rationalizing actions you know you shouldn't have taken, especially because you perceive that life hasn't been fair to you or you've endured something unjust. For example, someone saying, I had to start dealing drugs. What else was I going to do growing up the way I did in a neighborhood like mine? Number 3 is power orientation. This is the belief that the world is highly simplistic, often expressed in binaries such as strong or weak, or either I'm in control of others or I'm oppressed by others. Lots of abusers see the world this way, as well as abuse victims. Number 4 is discontinuing, yeah, discontinuity. I'm so sorry. This refers to inconsistent thinking or distraction, which can cause a person to struggle with their commitment to change. So, in the world of corrections, this is often referred to as ambivalence about change. And it's not uncommon for an offender to tell you the reasons they want to change and then almost immediately contradict themselves by, again, justifying criminal behavior or even re engaging with the behavior. Next, we have cognitive indolence. This is often referred to as lazy thinking because it's used to describe someone who is more focused on the short-term benefits of bad behavior rather than the long-term consequences of that behavior. In other words, they're not thinking things through. Next, we have cutoff. This refers to using thinking to cut yourself off from responsible behavior by convincing yourself that you don't care about potential victims, or even choosing to use drugs or alcohol to shut down your rational thought. In other words, you are literally cutting yourself off from what would internally deter you from criminal behavior, either your own sense of morality or your inhibitions. Number 7 is entitlement. This refers to using your thinking to generate permission to commit a crime. For example, I wouldn't be doing this if he hadn't just fired me. Or, this error in thinking is often associated with confusing wants with needs. For example, I needed her to pay attention to me, so I had to slash her tires. And lastly, number 8 is sentimentality. This refers to justifying bad behavior by focusing on examples of your good behavior. For example, sure, I used heroin this week, but I've been sober a whole month. I go to church every Sunday and I take good care of my kids. So, unlike other examples of rationalization, such as mollification and entitlement, sentimentality is about minimizing or cloaking your bad behavior by focusing attention on your good behavior. Now, I imagine that as you learn about these errors in thinking, you see your own thinking on display, or the thinking of someone in your life who isn't a persistent criminal offender. I think it's important to note that cognitive distortions are common, and thinking can be dysfunctional in a lot of our lives. So some of these distortions are also just examples of immaturity, ways of thinking that a lot of us grow out of as we age and assume greater responsibilities in our lives. In other words, just as Walters contends, these thinking errors alone do not cause criminal behavior. Keep in mind that Walters' theory begins with those early biological and social conditions. Cognition, in other words, is a link in the chain that explains criminal behavior. It alone is not the magic key to predicting and controlling how people behave. It is, however, a place where we can intervene. In other words, if we're interested in having our criminal justice system rehabilitate and help people change, focusing on cognition is an area of immense potential for behavioral transformation. The last factor I want to talk about today is mental illness. While it's perhaps normal to assume that people with severe mental disorders are unsafe or more prone to violence, the truth is that most acts of violence are not committed due to mental illness, and the majority of people living with these conditions are not violent. When we see mental illness and crime intersect, there's often a co-occurring condition that helps explain the crime, such as self-medication through substance abuse or perhaps a personality disorder. I'm hoping that this week's reading and reflection on mental illness and crime sparks some thought on the value you place on rehabilitative approaches to justice. So, a common rehabilitative model in our criminal justice system is a specialty court. These are not fact-finding courts. In other words, people in this court have already pled guilty to their crime, but they refer to a specialty court because there is some recognition that the offender could benefit from rehabilitative treatment and supervision. For example, these courts are sometimes called drug courts or mental health courts or domestic violence courts. They focus on a specialized type of offending or a criminogenic factor and always employ a rehabilitative approach to corrections. So this week I'm asking that you read an excerpt from Judge Ginger Lerner Wren's book, A Court of Refuge, on the implementation of our country's first mental health court. I hope that by reading and discussing it, you can get a better sense of how mental illness intersects with crime and criminal justice, as well as what a rehabilitative approach to justice looks like.